Pale King, David Foster Wallace, Chapter 2. From Midway, Claude Sylvanshine then flew on something called Consolidated Thrust Regional Lines down to Peoria, a terrifying 30-seater whose pilot had pimples at the back of his neck and reached back to pull a dingy fabric curtain over the cockpit, and the beverage service consisted of a staggering girl underhanding you nuts while you chugged a Pepsi. Sylvanshine's window seat was an 8-something, an emergency row, behind an older lady with a sack-like chin who could not seem, despite strenuous efforts to open her nuts. The core accounting equation, A equals L plus E, can be dissolved and reshuffled into everything from E equals A minus L to beyond. The craft rode the updrafts and downdrafts like a dingy in a gale. The only service into Peoria was regional out of either St. Louis or the two Chicagos. Sylvanshine had an inner ear thing and couldn't read on planes, but did read the emergency laminated card twice. It was mostly illustrations, for legal reasons. The airline had to presume illiteracy. Without being aware that he was doing so, Sylvanshine mentally repeated the word illiterate several dozen times until the word ceased to mean anything and became just a rhythmic sound, not unlovely, but out of sync with the propeller's flux's pulse. It was something he did when he was under stress and did not want an incursion. His point of departure was Dulles after a service shuttle from Shepherdstown, Martinsburg. The three major codifications of U.S. tax law being, of course, 16, 39, and 54, with 81 and 82's indexing and anti-abuse provisions also relevant. The fact that another major recodification was on the horizon would not, obviously, be on the CPA exam. Sylvanshine's private goal was to pass the CPA exam, thereby immediately advancing 2 pay grades. The extent of the recodification would, of course, depend in part on the service's success in carrying out the initiative's directives. The job and the exam had to occupy 2 separate parts of his mind. It was crucial that he maintain separation of powers, separation of the 2 areas. Calculating depreciation recapture for 1231 assets is a 5-step process. The flight took 50 minutes and seemed much longer. There was nothing to do, and nothing would hold still in his head, and all the confined noise, and after the nuts were gone, there was nothing else for Sylvanshine to do to occupy his mind but try to look at the ground, which appeared close enough that he could make out house colors and the types of different vehicles on the pale interstate the planes seemed to tack back and forth across. The cards' figures opening emergency doors and pulling cords and crossing their arms funerally with their seat cushions on their chests seemed amateurishly drawn, and their features little more than bumps. You couldn't see fear or relief or really anything on their faces as they slid down the emergency chutes in the drawing. Emergency doors' handles opened in one way, and emergency hatches over the wings opened in a totally different way. Components of equity include common stock, retained earnings, and how many different types of SE transaction. Distinguish between perpetual and periodic inventory, and explain the relations between a physical inventory and the cost of goods sold. The darkly gray head ahead of him gave off a scent of brill cream that was even now surely soaking and staining the little paper towel on the seat top. Sylvanshine wished again that Reynolds was with him on the flight. Sylvanshine and Reynolds were both aides to systems icon Merrill Errol Mel Laryl, although Reynolds was a GS-11 and Sylvanshine only a miserable and pathetic GS-9. Sylvanshine and Reynolds had lived together and gone everywhere together since the Rome REC debacle in 82. They weren't homosexual, they just lived together, and both worked closely with Dr. Lirrell at Systems. Reynolds had both his CPA and a degree in Information Systems Management, although he was only slightly more than 2 years Claude Silvenshine Sr. This asymmetry was just one more thing that compromised Silvenshine's self-regard since Rome and made him doubly loyal and grateful to Systems Director Lirrell for having salvaged him from the debris of the catastrophe in Rome and believing in his potential once his niche as a cog in the system was found. Rome. Interesting. The double entry method invented by Italian Pacioli during the same period as Christopher Columbus at Alia. The card indicated that this was the type of aircraft whose emergency oxygen was a fire extinguished thing beneath the seats rather than dropping from overhead. The primitive opacity of the figure's faces was usually scarier than fear or some kind of visible expression would have been. It was unclear whether the card's primary function was legal or PR or both. He briefly tried to remember the definition of yaw. Every so often while studying for the exam this winter, Silvenshine would burp, and it would seem like more than a burp. It would taste like he'd almost thrown up a little. A light rain made a moving lace on the window, and distended and cross-hatched land they went over. At root, Silvenshine saw himself as a dithering ninny with at most one marginal talent whose connection to him was itself marginal. Here is what occurred at the service's Rome, New York Northeast Regional Examination Center on or about the date in question. Two departments had fallen behind and reacted in a regrettably unprofessional fashion. An atmosphere of extreme stress was allowed to cloud judgment and overrule set procedures, the department attempting to hide the growing pile of returns and cross-audit receipts and W-2 1099 copies, rather than duly reporting the backlog and requesting that some of the excess be rerouted to other centers. There failed to be full disclosure and prompt remedial action. Just where the failure and breakdown had occurred was still a matter of controversy, despite blame-storming sessions at the very highest levels of compliance. Though ultimately the responsibility lay with the Rome rec director, despite the fact that it was never quite established whether the department heads had made her fully aware of the extent of the backlog. Why in the world are we talking about Rome here in relationship to tax returns? The dark service joke about this director now had been that her desk had had a Truman-esque wooden plaque on it which read, "What, Buck?" It had taken 3 weeks for district audit sections to start howling over the shortfall of examined returns for audit and our automated collections systems, and the complaints had slowly worked their way up and over into inspections, as anyone should have been able to figure was only a matter of time. The Rome director had taken early retirement, and one group manager had been fired outright, which was exceedingly rare for the GS-13s. It was obviously important that remedial action be quiet and that undue publicity not compromise the public's full faith and confidence in the service. No one threw forms away. Hid, yes, but not destroyed or discarded. Even in the midst of disastrous departmental psychosis, no one could bring himself to burn, shred, or pack in hefties and discard. That would have been a real disaster. That would have become public. The emergency hatch's window was nothing more than several layers of plastic, it appeared, the inside of which gave ominously under digital pressure. Over the window was a stern injunction against opening the emergency hatch, accompanied by an iconic triptych explaining how to open just this hatch. As a system, in other words, it was poorly thought through. What was now called stress used to be called tension or pressure. Pressure was now more like something you put on someone else, as in high-pressure salesman. Reynolds said one of Dr. Lyrle's interbranch liaisons had described the Peoria wreck as a real pressure cooker, although that was in terms of exams, not personnel, to which latter Silvershine was posted as advance and ground lane for a possible systems full out. The truth, which Reynolds had stopped but just short of expressing as such, was that the assignment couldn't be that sensitive if they trusted it to Silvershine. There were, according to his researches, registration slots for the CPA examination at Peoria College of Business on November the 7th and 8th, and at Joliet Community College November the 14th through 15th. Duration of this posting unknown. One of the most effective isometric exercises for the desk bound is to sit up quite straight and tighten the large muscles of the buttocks, holding for a count of 8, then release. It tones, aids blood flow and alertness, and can, unlike other isometric exercises, be performed even in public, being largely obscured by the desk's material mass. Avoid grimacing or loud exhalations upon release. Preferential transfers, liquidation provisions, unsecured creditors, claims against bankruptcy estate as per Chapter 7. He had his hat in his lap over the belt. Systems Director Lyrle had started as a GS9 auditor in Danville, Virginia, before the eclat and rapid rise. He had the strength of 10 men. When Silvershine studied for the exam now, the worst thing was that studying any one thing would set off a storm in his head about all the other things he hadn't studied and felt he was still weak on, making it almost impossible to concentrate, causing him to fall even further behind. He'd been studying for the CPA exam for 3.5 years. It was like trying to build a model in a high wind. The most important component in organizing a structure for effective study is something. What killed him were the story problems. Reynolds had passed the exam on his first sit. Yaw was rotating slightly from side to side. The word for pitching forward and back was something else. Axes were involved. There was something called gimbal that came into his mind whenever he saw the Donegan kid at Lombard High, who then later ended up at Mission Control for the last 2 Apollos, and had his picture in a glass case by the office at Lombard. The worst, then, was that he knew what teachers were the last people suited for their jobs, and they then smelled some part of this knowledge on him and were at their worst when he was watching. It was a loop. Silvershine's senior yearbook in his trunk in storage in Philly was almost wholly unsigned. The older party next door was still trying to open her package of nuts with her teeth, but had been clear on not wanting help or needing help. The projected benefit obligation, PBO, equals the present value of all benefits attributed by the pension benefit formula to employee services rendered prior to that date. If you spell it fast with stress on the H and the A, and then the second A and the H again, then headache becomes lilting children's rhymed refrain, something to jump rope to. Look down your shirt and spell attic. One of the teenagers outside the video arcade next to the facilities at Midway had worn a black T-shirt with the words Sympathy for Nixon Tour, and then a long list of cities in tiny applique letters. The teen was not on the flight, had then sat briefly across from Silvershine in the gate area, and had picked at his face with a concentration that wasn't at all like the absent face-picking and feeling at parts of the face that accompanied concentrated work in the service. Silvershine still dreamed of desk drawers and air ducts stuffed with forms and forms' edges protruding from grills over the ducts, and the utility closet stacked to the top with Hollerith cards, and the inspections division lady forcing the door, and the cards all falling out on her like McGee's closet as the whole debacle caught up to them after they fell behind on cross-audit receipts at the Rome wreck. He dreamed still of Grecula and Harris disabling the Fornix mainframe was something poured from a thermos into the rear vent as hisses and bits of blue-tinged smoke issued. The teen had had no vocational aura at all. This happened with some people. Ethical standards comprising the exam's whole first unit, about which there were also many service jokes. A violation of the profession's ethical standards most likely would have occurred when, such was the propeller's otherworldly sound that Sylvanshine now could hear nothing more than drifting syllables of the exchanges around him. The woman's claw on the steel armrest between them was a horrible sight that he declined to attend to. Old people's hands frightened and repelled him. He'd had grandparents whose hands he could remember and their laps looking alien and claw-like. Upon incorporation, Jones Inc. issues common stock at a price in excess of its par value. It was difficult not to imagine the faces of those whose jobs were writing these questions, what they thought about, what their professional hopes and dreams were. Many of the questions were like little stories with all the human meat left out. On December the 1st, 1982, Clark Company leases office space for 3 years at a monthly rental of $20,000. For a count of 100, Sylvanshine tried flexing first one buttock and then the other instead of both buttocks at once, which required concentration and strange type of non-control, like trying to wiggle your ears in the mirror. He tried the incline to the side thing of stretching out his neck muscles on each side very gently and gradually, but still got a look from the older lady, who with her dark dress and staved-in face appeared more and more skull-like and frightening, and like some type of omen of death or crushing failure on the CPA exam, which two things had collapsed in Sylvanshine's psyche to a single image of his silently, expresslessly pushing a wide industrial mop down a corridor lined with frosted glass doors, bearing other men's names. Even the sight of a mop, rollable bucket, or custodian with his name woven in red Palmer script on the breast pocket of his gray jumpsuit, as at Midway, outside the men's room, whose little yellow sign warned bilingually of wet floors, the cursive name something beginning with M, Morris or Maurice, the man fitted to his job like a man to be the exact pocket of space he displaces. Now rattled Sylvanshine to the point where precious time was lost before he could even think about how to set up a workable schedule for maximally efficient reviewing for the exam, even mentally, which he did every day. His great weakness was strategic organization and apportionment of time, as Reynolds pointed out at every opportunity, and joining Claude, too, for Christ's sakes, just take a book off the stack and study, instead of sitting there noodling impotently about how best to study. Stuffing returns behind cabinets and into air ducts, locking desk drawers so filled with cross-reference forms that they could not open anyhow, hiding things beneath other things in Tingles's baskets, Reynolds had simply appeared at the director's office before the hearing, and the whole personal disaster seemingly vanished in some bureaucratic puff of violet smoke, and a week later Sylvanshine was unpacking his boxes at Systems in Martinsburg under Dr. Lirrell. The whole thing felt like being in a near traffic fatality avoided by inches, and later not being able to even think of the whole thing lest you begin shaking and be unable to function. It had been such a near disaster. The entire Fats pod had melted down. The small sound of a simulated bell accompanied the overhead gliff of seat belts and cigarettes lighting up or disappearing. Sylvanshine looked up every time without consciously intending to. In obtaining evidential matter in support of financial statement assertions, the auditor develops specific audit objectives in light of those assertions. An infant keened in some aisle behind him. Sylvanshine imagined the mother simply unbuckling and withdrawing to some other aisle and leaving it there. In Philly, after the frenzy surrounding the introduction of inflation indexes that new templates had to be configured for in 81, he had been diagnosed with a stress-related pinched nerve in his neck and upper back, which the enforced unnatural posture of the tiny narrow 8B and the death-like claw on the armrest beside him aggravated it if he gave it his attention. It was true. The entire ball game, in terms of both the exam and life, was what you gave attention to versus what you willed yourself to not. Sylvan viewed himself as weak or defective in the area of will. Most of what others esteemed or valued in him was unwilled, simply given, like a person's height or facial symmetry. Reynolds called him weak-minded, and it was true. He had a serial memory of their neighbor, Mr. Satterthwaite, filling in scuffs on his postal uniform shoes with a black pen, which then, before he was aware of it, expanded into a whole narrative memory of Mr. and Mrs. Satterthwaite, who were childless and did not, if you first met them, appear at all that friendly or interested in children, nevertheless allowing their backyard to become the de facto headquarters for all the children in the neighborhood, and even the slapdash and unsound treehouse they had allowed Sylvan and the Roman Catholic boy with the tic like a chronic wince to try to construct in one of their trees. And Sylvan could not recall whether it was because the boy's family had moved away that the treehouse was not completed, or whether the move had taken place later, and the treehouse had simply been too slapdash and sap-soaked to continue with. Mrs. Satterthwaite had had lupus and was often indisposed. Deviation rates, precision limits, stratified sampling. As Dr. Lirrill had explained it, entropy was a measure of a certain type of information that there was no point in knowing. Lirrill's axiom was that the definitive test of the efficiency of any organization structure was information and the filtering and dissemination of information. Real entropy had zippo to do with temperature. Another effective concentration device was to summon into one's mind a soothing and low-pressure outdoor scene, either imagined or from memory, which was even more effective if the scene comprised or included a pond, lake, brook, or stream, as water had been proven to have a calming and centering effect on the involuntary nervous system. But try as he might after the buttock exercises, Sylvan could summon only a jagged primary color array that looked like a psychedelic poster or something resembling what you see if you're poked in the eye and then close your eye in pain. The oddness of the word indisposed proved that the relation of long-term bond prices to long-term capital gains tax rates is not inverse. He knew who on the plane was in love, who would say they were in love because it was what you were supposed to say, and who would say they were not in love. Reynolds' own professed take on marriage, family, was that from boyhood on he had never liked fathers and had no wish to be one. In 3 separate venues in today's various airports, Sylvan had found himself locking eyes with 30-year-old men who had infants in high-tech papoose-like packs on their backs, their wives with quilted infant supply bags at their sides. The wives in charge, the men appearing essentially soft or softened in some way, desperate in a resigned way, their stride not quite a trudge, their eyes empty and over-mild with the weary stoicism of young fathers. Reynolds would call it not stoicism, but acquiescence to some large and terrible truth. The term dependent includes any person who qualifies as a dependency exemption, or would otherwise qualify as a dependency exemption except that the gross income and joint return tests are not met. Name 2 standard devices by which fiduciaries may legally shift tax liability to beneficiaries. The term passive losses was not even on the CPA exam. It was vital to divide service priorities and exam priorities into 2 exclusive modules or networks. One of 4 stated projects was to enhance Peoria 047's ability to distinguish legitimate investment partnerships from tax shelters whose entire purpose was to avoid taxes. The key was identifying passive versus active losses. The actual project was to create both a case and a control structure for the automation of crucial examination functions at the Peoria Center. The goal was to have automation in place by the time revenue rulings against certain passive loss provisions were codified in next year's tax law. The older lady's rouge, very red, in a paperback with a bookmark's tongue, unopened in her lap, the veinous and piebald claw. Sylvan Shine's seat number was right there stamped onto the brushed steel of the armrest, next to the claw. Its nails were deeply, perfectly red. The smell of his mother's polish remover, of her makeup compact, the way wisps of her hair escaped the bun and curled down the back of her neck in the steam of the kitchen when he and O'Dowd had returned from the Satterwaites' backyard with hammered thumbs and sap in their lashes. Wisps and flashes of uncolored cloud flashed past the window. Above and below were a different story, but there was always something disappointing about clouds when you were inside them. They ceased to be clouds at all. It just got really foggy. Yaw was way in a mirror. It occurred for no reason. Sylvan Shine then spent some time trying to feel the fact that his personal body was traveling at the same speed as the craft he was inside. On a large jet, it felt like merely sitting in a loud, narrow room. Here, at least, the changes in the seats and belts' pressures against him allowed him to be aware of movement, and there seemed to be some security in the physical candor of this, which partly offset the fragility and spatter potential of the sound of the propellers, which Sylvanshine tried to think of what the props sounded like but could not, except as a gnawingly hypnotic rotary hum, so total that it might have been silence itself. A lobotomy involved some kind of rod or probe inserted through the eye socket. The term was always frontal lobotomy. But was there any other kind? Knowing that internal stress could cause failure on the exam merely set up internal stress about the prospect of internal stress. There must be some other way to deal with the knowledge of the disastrous consequences fear and stress could bring about. Some answer or trick of the will, the ability not to think about it. What if everyone knew this trick but Claude Sylvanshine? He tended to conceptualize some ultimate platonic level terror as a bird of prey in whose mere aloft shadow the prey was stricken and paralyzed, trembling as the shadow enlarged and became inevitability. He frequently had this feeling. What if there was something essentially wrong with Claude Sylvanshine that wasn't wrong with other people? What if he was simply ill-suited, the way some people are born without limbs or certain organs, the neurology of failure? What if he was simply born and destined to live in the shadow of total fear and despair, and all his so-called activities were pathetic attempts to distract him from the inevitable? Discuss important differences between reserve accounting and charge-off accounting in the tax treatment of bad debts. Surely fear is a type of stress. Tedium is like stress, but its own category of woe. Sylvanshine's father, whenever something professionally bad happened, which was a lot, had a habit of saying, "Woe to Sylvanshine." There is an anti-stress technique called thought stopping. The excess present value index is the ratio of the present value of future cash inflows to the initial investment. Segment, significant segment, combined segment revenue, absolute combined segment revenue, operating profit. Material price variance, direct material price variance. He thought of the removable grate over the air duct above his and Ray Harris's desk in the Rome wreck, and the sound of the grate being removed and then jammed back into place and driven home with the heel of Harris's hand, and then recoiled from the thought in a way that made it feel as if the craft were accelerating. The interstate highway below disappeared, and then sometimes reappeared as a spot Sylvanshine had to squash his cheek right up against the plastic inner window to see. Then, as the rain recommenced, and he could tell they were beginning descent, it reappeared in the window's center, light traffic crawling with a futile, pointless pathos you could never sense on the ground. What if it felt as slow to actually drive as it looked from this perspective? It would be like trying to run underwater. The whole ball game was perspective, filtering, the choice of perception's objects. Sylvanshine tried to envision the small plane as seen from the ground, a cruciform shape against the old bathwater color of the cloud cover, its lights blinking complexly in the rain. He imagined rain on his face. It was light, West Virginia rain. He hadn't heard one unit of thunder. Sylvanshine had once been on a first date with a Xerox rep who had complex and slightly repulsive patterns of callus on her fingers from playing the banjo semi-professionally as her off-time passion. And he remembered as the overhead bell again rang and the sign lit, the no cigarette glyph legally redundant, the pad's calluses deep yellow in the low dinner light as he'd spoken to the musician about forensic accounting's intricacies and the hive-like organization of the Northeast Rec, which was only one small part of the service, and the service's history and little understood ideals and sense of mission, and the old joke to him about how service employees' social situations would go to such absurd lengths to avoid telling people that they worked for the IRS because it often cast such a social pall because of popular perceptions of the service and its employees, all the while watching the calluses as the woman worked her knife and fork, and that he'd been so nervous and tense that he'd yammered on and on about himself, and never asked her sufficiently about herself, her history with the banjo, and what it meant to her, which was why she hadn't liked him enough, and they hadn't connected. He'd never given the woman with the banjo a chance. He saw now that what appears to be egoism so often isn't. In some ways, Sylvanshine was a whole different person now in systems. Their descent was mainly a heightening of the specificity of what lay below, fields revealed as plowed and perpendicularly furrowed in silos as adjoined by canted chutes and belts, and an industrial park as individual buildings with reflective windows and complicated clumps of cars in the parking lots. Each car not only parked by a different human individual, but conceived, designed, assembled from parts, each one of which was designed and made, transported, sold, financed, purchased, and insured by human individuals, each with life stories and self concepts that all fit together into a larger pattern of facts. Reynolds' dictum was that reality was a fact pattern, the bulk of which was entropic and random. The trick was homing in on which facts were important. Reynolds was a rifle to Sylvanshine's shotgun. The feeling of a slight trickle of blood from his right nostril was a hallucination and to be ignored absolutely. The feeling simply did not exist. Sinus trouble ran in Sylvanshine's family in the worst way. Aurelius of ancient Rome, first principles, exemptions versus deductions, for AGI versus from AGI. A loss sustained from a non-business bad debt is always classified as a short-term capital loss and may therefore be deducted on Schedule D as per the following IRC. One building's roof had what was either a marked helipad or a complicated visual signal to the planes descending overhead, and the pitch of the propeller's doubled hum was different, and his right sinus was even now ballooning redly in his skull, and they really were descending. The term was controlled descent. The interstate now rococo with exits and half cloverleafs, and the traffic denser and with something insistent about it. And the claw rose from the steel armrest as there appeared a body of water below, a lake or delta, and Sylvanshine felt one of his feet was asleep as he tried to recall the peculiar crossed-arm configuration with which the figures on the card held their seat cushions to their chests in the unlikely event of a water landing. And now they did really and truly yaw, and their speed became more evident in the rate of passage of things below in what had to be an older district of Peoria, qua human city, close-packed blocks of sooty brick and angled roofs, and a television antenna with a flag attached, and a flash of bourbon-colored river that was not the previous body of water but might have been connected to it, nothing like the stately and befrothed stretch of Potomac, that obtruded through Systems' windows on Antietam's hollowed site, noting that the stewardess in her fold-down seat had her head down and arms about her legs. where at year's end the aggregate fair value of Brown's sellable securities exceeds the aggregate carrying amount at the beginning of the year, as out of nowhere appeared an expanse of pale cement rising to meet them with no warning bell or announcement, and his soda can wedged in the seat pocket, as the gray death's head beside whipped right and left, and the propeller's shimmering sound shifted either pitch or timbre, and the older lady stiffening in her seat and raising her pleated chin in fear, and repeating what sounded to Sylvanshine like the word chump, as veins stood bluely in the fist before her, in which was enclosed the crushed and bulbous but still unopened foil pack of off-brand nuts. The fifth effect has more to do with you, how you are perceived. It's powerful, although its use is more restricted. Pay attention, boy. The next suitable person you're in light conversation with, you stop suddenly in the middle of the conversation and look at the person closely and say, "What's wrong?" You say it in a concerned way. He'll say, "What do you mean?" You say, "Something's wrong, I can tell. What is it?" And he'll look stunned and say, "How do you know?" He doesn't realize something's always wrong with everybody, often more than one thing. He doesn't know everybody's always going around all the time with something wrong and believing they are exerting great willpower and control to keep other people for whom they think nothing's ever wrong from seeing it. This is the way of people. Suddenly ask what's wrong, and whether they open up and spill their guts or deny it and pretend you are off, they'll think you are perceptive and understanding. They'll either be grateful or they'll be frightened and avoid you from then on. Both reactions have their uses, as we'll get to. You can play it either way. Stopping the reading at page 20. David Foster Wallace's The Pale King